Hi, everybody. This is Mary Peabody, and good morning or good afternoon, I guess, depending on where you're sitting. Thanks for joining us. If you didn't join us last weekend or last month, rather, this is the second of our three-part marketing series, which we'll be wrapping up next month. But this month, we're going to be talking about pricing, and pricing is one of those issues that everybody's interested in, but people get a little nervous about. So we're going to try to take some of the mystery out of pricing today. And I had asked folks how they're doing, and I'm seeing a whole bunch of different weather reports coming in. And I'm delighted to see some of my colleagues at the Women in Ag Learning Network are here as well, so I trust that they'll chime in and help keep me honest. So we have a lot to cover today, and I'm going to be going through some material pretty quickly, but and some of it may seem pretty complicated, but don't get discouraged. There's lots of material out there to help fill in the gaps. There are workshops, there's mini courses, there's publications. That said, certainly if you have questions as we go, please feel free to post them in the chat box, and I'm happy to take questions as they come, and at the very end I'll be giving you my email address, so if there's anything you want to follow up on, or if you're looking for a very specific resource, feel free to get in touch, and we'd be happy to help you out if we can. So we're going to be talking about identifying your costs, some factors that affect pricing, and some basic survival tips. And since this is being sponsored in part by the Women in Ag Learning Network, I want to say a word to all of the women out there. One of the reasons that I do this, especially for the women farmers that I work with and small business owners, is because I think a lot of the social and cultural expectations that women are given and grow up with also make it very hard for us to ask for fair compensation for our work. So in addition to the really big issue of, the fact that in this country we don't necessarily want to pay for our fair price for food, there's also some other issues that are sort of laid on top of that are specific to women. So to the extent that we can work through some of this, I'm happy to do that. So the math is really simple. The way that it works is profit is simply income minus your expenses, and it's math that you probably learned in the second or third grade. So it's not the math that gets in the way. It's a lot of other stuff that happens that makes pricing kind of complicated. And one of the things that happens is, that what should be a really simple transaction, do I want to buy that salsa or not, is complicated by a lot of baggage. So you have cost, which is a financial transaction. The viability of the business depends on covering your costs. But you have a price, which is a psychological construct for the consumer, and it's caught up with a lot of issues related to money and security and value. So your consumers are sort of in conflict as well. And then you have worth, which is often an emotional construct, especially for artisans and farmers and chefs, anyone that pulls from their creative side to produce something that has a deep emotional connection to the product, which can supersede cost and price. So yeah, you thought making change would be the hardest part of selling, but it turns out that it gets very messy very quickly when you're selling directly to the consumer. So how are you going to figure out what that fair price is? As I said earlier, accurate pricing is both really an art and a science. On paper, it boils down to a simple equation: labor plus expenses plus materials plus overhead plus profit, and you should always include some profit in there, equals your selling price. And that looks easy enough. So you're wondering why labor is showing up at the top, but in parentheses maybe. And that's because in most of the businesses that I work with, this is a huge category that too often gets ignored for too long. And again, this is even more common in women's businesses than it is in farming in general, although it is certainly an issue in all of small-scale agriculture and many related food businesses. So, all right, factors that affect pricing. Again, this is not rocket science. Production and harvesting are one of the biggest factors in price setting since they relate directly to the cost of producing your product. And by the way, if anyone's listening to this program and you don't actually produce food, but you produce fiber, or maybe you're an artisan, the principles are all the same. How you get to your end price is pretty much the same regardless of what the product is. So feel free to extrapolate what I'm saying to your business. Certainly quality and selection plays a role. And this is a place where perception is reality. If the consumer sees something off about the product, if it's smaller or larger or bruised or off-colored or wrinkled or dented, or in any way looks different than what the consumer's mental image of the product is, then you have some sort of cognitive dissonance there. The consumer is thinking, that lettuce doesn't look like the picture of the lettuce in my recipe. What's wrong with that? Is it going to work? So you have this sort of unease, this tension that's set up right at the get-go. The location of the market, as we discussed last month when we were talking about demographic trends, some geographic regions have more money than others, and that's just a reality that we have to live with. That's why location matters in pricing, and we'll cover that a little bit more later on. Customer income and demographics, again, this builds on what we discussed last month when we were talking about trends. You need to understand who your target customer is and what their expectations are related to products and pricing. Now, last month I talked briefly about the two big demographic bubbles, the boomers and the millennials. I'm going to talk more about those groups in the next slides because there are some fundamental differences in how they operate. Volume is obviously a player in pricing. You just have to look at the Walmarts and Amazons to see that. The more of something that you produce, the lower per unit production cost you're going to have, which means that you can then transfer that perceived savings onto your customer. And we'll get to the why of that, again, in a few slides. Demand and supply is also pretty straightforward. If you have that first strawberry of the season, you can charge pretty much whatever you want, and somebody's going to pay for it. Likewise, if you're selling green beans at the peak of season, not so much. You're going to have to go with whatever the market dictates. And operating and overhead are really, really important, but the tricky thing is that they are extremely variable. So let me just say a few more words about that and repeat this because it bears repeating. The single biggest factor in your pricing decisions is always going to be your own personal operating costs, and those are going to vary from business to business. And that is why it is so hard to come up with a cost when somebody says, what should I charge for a dozen eggs, or what should I charge for a bale of hay, or what should I charge for a skein of yarn? The answer is always going to be it depends, because it really comes down to what the costs that you have embedded in producing that are going to be. So let's just talk a few minutes about expenses and about how to capture and record your expenses. Most of your production expenses will fall neatly into one of two categories, fixed expenses or variable expenses. Just as their name applies, fixed expenses are those costs that remain constant regardless of your production volume. Common fixed expenses include mortgage payments, loan payments for equipment or livestock, utilities, insurance premiums, things that you very often get a monthly bill for and you just keep paying regardless. Variable expenses are those things that fluctuate as your production fluctuates. Example of these expenses might include feed or seeds or seasonal labor. Packaging supplies can be loaded in there. And while most of your expenses will be fairly easy to categorize, there's almost always a few gray areas that can go either way. And in those situations, it's not as critical which category you assign to it, is that you be consistent over time. So the more cost that you place in the variable category, the more conservative your pricing strategy will be. So, good record keeping is an essential element in good pricing, as it is in good business management. You have to understand which expenses, both fixed and variable, are associated with your product. And the best way to do that is to have a list of expenses associated with your product and keep the list as complete and accurate as possible, which means that you're going to have to update it periodically because, as we all know, costs change. If you have a business that produces multiple products, then many of your expenses will have to be averaged out across all products. And we'll come back to that in just a minute, but that happens very often on small-scale diversified farms where, for example, the property taxes you pay may be supporting 3 or 4 different profit centers, and it's not fair to lump all of those expenses into one product. You need to average those out across all of your profit centers and products. So by keeping careful and accurate records, you'll be able to see clearly where you're most vulnerable. In this way, you can be better prepared for any pricing fluctuations that have the potential to impact your business. For example, if you have a livestock operation, the cost of feed will almost certainly be a major expense category for you. If the price of that feed should increase 10 or 15%, that's going to impact your cost of production pretty significantly. If you have a flower shop and you deliver flowers, then a sudden increase or decrease in the price of fuel might cause you some problems. The more aware you are of your key expense categories, the more prepared you can be to adjust your prices if necessary. And I do encourage people to check in on those prices, not weekly, maybe not even monthly, but at least during the season, somewhere around mid-season, and make whatever adjustments that you need to make, because you can't really afford to be carrying a loss for your customers. So tracking labor, I know this is a touchy subject for people. It's common for small business owners and farmers to ask if they should include their labor. The short answer is, of course, you should include your labor. The reality is you may very well have to compromise on how much of your labor you get to recover, especially in the early years of your business. So I think a more realistic answer is you should know what it's costing you, and you should record it, but you may not always be able to recover it. So that's just one of the realities, particularly in the early years of your business. A useful tool that you can use for this purpose, though, is a labor log, and it doesn't have to be fancy. If you get into the habit of just jotting down what you've done every couple of hours, just on a little tiny 3-ring binder that fits in your pocket or on your smartphone, you can set up a table really quickly that will allow you to do that. It doesn't have to be perfect. A partial log is better than no log at all. And when you're working at a task that benefits several products, average your time across all the products. So, for example, if you spend 4 hours this morning working on a marketing brochure for your farm stand, there's multiple products that are going to benefit. So you divide that 4 hours across all of your different products. And that helps you to maintain an accurate labor log. And while you're tracking your labor, be sure to use the log for other purposes as well. A labor log can be a useful way to track your equipment usage, which will be a great help in assessing how many equipment hours to charge to a product, and it helps you be more efficient in maintenance and repairs for that equipment too. So what sounds like a really burdensome task is actually quite simple, and you can do it pretty quickly, and you can actually get some additional bang for your buck if you figure out how to use it for multiple purposes. So, and this is just an example that I put up there to go back to fixed and variable costs. And since it's almost maple season here in Vermont, I thought I'd just use a maple example. But you can see in the fixed costs, you have your land, which is your mortgage or your rent. There's property taxes, insurance, evaporators, and sugar house expenses, and your insurance. And on the variable side, you've got, pipeline or buckets or taps and shipping expenses, fuel expenses, your containers, your labels. And here I have labor as a variable. Labor is always a tricky one. And sometimes it belongs in the fixed, and sometimes it belongs in the variable. And again, it really is more important that you be consistent over time than exactly where you put it. And I see that Laura's asked a really good question about an app for tracking labor. And I started to say there must be an app out there, and I'm positive there is. I don't have one right off the top of my head, but if somebody has one, please post it in the chat box. And if nobody does, I will make that my homework to go out and see if I can find one and make sure we get it onto the website along with the recording of this. So, all right, let's just summarize where we've been here, because we packed a lot into these last few slides. And this is the fundamental elements of pricing that we've covered so far. By the time you get your product to market, you have absorbed some costs, both variable and fixed, and hopefully you've included some profit into your calculations. By dividing that cost into the number of units that you've produced, you're going to arrive at a per unit price. And now you get to sort of the art of the pricing. We have to assess that price in light of the reality of the marketplace. And this means comparing our price to what our competitors are charging. And it means that we have to assess whether the profit per unit is reasonable given the volume that we're going to be able to produce. In other words, we have a price, but we have to determine whether that price can stand up in the marketplace. And that's what we're going to spend a few slides on now. Excuse me. So just one other thing about pricing. As I said, there's a psychological element of pricing, there's an emotional element of pricing, and then there is a business element of pricing. And, consumers are complicated creatures, and they typically read a lot into pricing, sometimes even more than what is actually there. And so what you want your pricing to say about your business is that you're honest, you're fair, you're ethical. Now, I know a lot of us have had the experience of where you go to a grocery store or you go into a store to buy something and it's marked down like 70% off or clearance or must go. And part of you is like, oh, I want a bargain. And the other part of you is probably thinking, I wonder what's wrong with it. And your customers are going to be thinking exactly that too. So I always say for folks that as you're developing your pricing strategy, just make sure that it's accurate, that it makes sense to you, and that it's transparent, and that you can actually communicate it to your customer if they begin to ask questions and they want to know why is something, why were strawberries this much in May and now they're down this much, 4 weeks later. Just that you can explain to them. That sometimes is all that it takes to make a customer a very loyal customer. Okay. So, going back to what we talked a little bit about last month when we were talking about demographics and trends, I was talking about these two big bubbles in the demographics, the boomers and the millennials, and I said that they're different. It's always unfair to generalize, but I'm going to do it anyway. So just know going into this discussion that this model does not fit exactly, and it certainly doesn't fit everyone. We're talking about broad generalities here. So for the purposes of marketing, you should know whether your target market is heavily boomers or heavily millennials or a mix of both. And then, of course, we have the Gen Xers in the middle, too, but they aren't quite the force of nature simply because they are smaller in numbers than these other two groups are. And aside from the attributes that you see on the slide in front of you, the way that these generations engage with technology is completely different. So we boomers have embraced technology, and we've made it a part of how we live. But fundamentally, boomers still see this as a tool. Millennials, on the other hand, see technology as an extension of themselves. The smartphone isn't a tool, it's an extension of who they are. So while boomers might most likely ask you if you accept credit cards, a millennial is going to likely assume that they can just swipe their smartphone at your scanner to pay on the way out. And it makes a little bit of a difference in terms of how you position yourself. So just to go over some of these attributes here, boomers were raised to value money and to value being able to have money, that money could buy you things. And so we didn't always make the smartest decisions, especially when it came to things like saving for retirement, but, we certainly did learn, the value of employment and the value of having money to consume things. Millennials, on the other hand, their value is all about their heart and their passion. And they are very altruistic, which is not to say there are not altruistic baby boomers, but, again, we're generalizing. Boomers tend to talk about ownership and possession. It tends to be that boomers like to own their own homes, own their own land, own cars, whereas millennials, you'll see, they want to access these things, but they don't necessarily have any driving incentive to own it. So you will see that millennials very often are foregoing home ownership or foregoing even buying a car. I mean, I have a 24-year-old in my household who has absolutely zero interest. She has a driving license, but she has zero interest in owning a car and taking on that added expense. Whereas I can't really imagine my life without a car. again, boomers are about consumption. You've seen that the entire life cycle of the baby boomers has been about sort of trends in consumption and second homes and retirement and trips and nice clothes and things like that. Millennials are much more oriented towards conserving, and that's partly just the time frame that they grew up in. You will see boomers have a strong loyalty to an individual, whereas millennials have a loyalty to a group. And in economic terms, you will see baby boomers generally coming from a sense of abundance, that there was two thoughts around money acquisition. One is a theory of abundance, and the other is the theory of scarcity. And basically, abundance assumes that when you need it, it'll show up, and that it'll always be there, and that money is not something to be fretted over or hoarded, but that it will just show up. And scarcity is a mindset that, money is sort of precious and scarce, and that you may need to be very careful about the decisions you make. And so, again, if you think about the time frames that these two groups have grown up in, you'll understand. The millennials grew up in a time of financial uncertainty. They grew up in the time of 9/11 and the financial meltdown that occurred after that. Many millennials are underemployed or unemployed, and so they don't have the same sense of entitlement or the same sense of abundance that a lot of the boomers have had. So to the extent that they're different, it's very worth you as a business owner knowing who you're marketing to, because the kinds of words that you use, the kind of pictures that you use, the story that you tell will be different depending on which group is your primary audience. Okay, so questions for you to be thinking about. It's always good business practice to review your pricing strategy periodically. Costs change over time, and your prices need to reflect those changes. And while you're at it, there's some good guiding questions that you should consider when you're thinking about your prices and your products. So having prices that are substantially over or underpriced for the market can raise red flags for your customers, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. And it's always a good idea to have your prices figured out on a per-unit basis, as I said earlier. And one of the reasons is that so you can sort of know where you stand. If you're losing money on every unit you produce, chances are that just producing more units isn't going to help. You're just going to start losing more faster. So you also want to consider whether you have the capacity to produce the volume of product that you need to produce to make the profit that you want or need to make. And no matter what you produce, there's an upper limit to the quantity that you can produce. And that upper limit is worth knowing because you can use it to see if you have any hope of being profitable in a given market. So eggs are a classic example that I like to use just because I've had a lot of people come to me with sort of business plans that lean heavily on eggs, and a lot of people have hens these days. So let's say you have 72 laying hens all at peak production. That means at the best you're going to get about an egg a day from them. So that translates to about 6 dozen eggs a day and 42 dozen a week if I've done my math right. So let's say you calculate your break-even cost and you discover that you need 50 dozen eggs to reach your break-even point. Well, right out of the gate, you're in a bind given that you're 8 dozen short every single week. So, and if you add more hens, which a lot of people would say is the solution, that's going to change your cost of production. So you're going to have to go ahead and recalculate a little bit. If you aren't sure of how to calculate your break-even cost, I'd encourage you to investigate it and give it a try. And again, this is one of the things that we've got some resources for, and there's other resources out there that are equally good. The reason that I really like break-even calculations is that it forces you to really zero in on your costs, both those fixed and variable costs. But the good news is that it lets you play around with prices and quantities without a lot of risk. You can just sort of do it with a pencil and paper or a calculator. So, and the last point related that I mentioned here is familiarity, and that is related to how familiar your product is to your target customer. And I'm talk about that in a couple of slides here, but for now, let's just go back to the very first point and talk about a little bit more about are your prices in line with your competition. And I see Julie's got a question here, and let's see, yes, you can have access to the slides. We'll post them. The recording will be available, and then I will work with Lisa and Beth to make sure that the slides actually get on our website as well so that you can have those. Okay, so your price. You've already figured out your costs. You know what you should be charging, and now the next thing is scout out the competition and see what does the pricing continuum look like. And the pricing continuum runs from very low to very high, probably. And consumers, again, being the complicated beast that we are, we're equally suspicious of prices that are too low and too high. So we have this thing called a pricing window, where things are just right, that it just seems fair, and it's like, well, that's a fair price, and it seems like a good quality, and so I'm going to go ahead and buy that. So my first advice to every business owner is always figure out your prices before you scout the competition. The temptation is really strong to just follow the herd, but I can tell you from painful experience that the folks you're following probably have not done their homework, and y'all might be selling at a loss. But once you know your prices, it's time to check out that competition. And there is this concept called the pricing window, and as long as your price falls within that window, you're not going to raise any flags with your customers. But if your prices fall below or above, then you have to do some extra communication to explain to your customers why that is the case. We all love a bargain, but if it's too good to be true, it probably is. So this is the tension that's going on in your customers' minds when they're standing there trying to make up their mind. And we've been trained that, it's not all bargains are good bargains. So on the other end, if it's way over market price, we start to wonder, how could it really be that much better than the one that is like priced lower? Then you have to fall back on your attributes list. So if you find your price is way out of that window, then you're going to have to start really emphasizing things like quality or scarcity. This is the very first one, or this is the very last one of the season. Or safety or artisanship. This is a one-of-a-kind product handmade for you. And there is some success with that, with customers, with working that, particularly in the food industry and the small farm industry. So I wouldn't say don't do it. I would say first know your prices, then check and see where you fall in relation to your competitors. And then if you're going to be selling above that window, be sure that you have evidence ready to help your customer understand why your product is worth paying that extra, 20% or 25% or 30%. Okay, so I said I would get to product maturity, and I will right now. A few minutes ago, we talked about how familiar your product is to your consumer, and what does this have to do with pricing? Well, the less familiar your product is to your consumer, the more money you're going to have to spend in your marketing. And that might be in the form of sampling, or it might be in the form of promotional materials to explain to your customers about what your product is and how to use it, or it might be in waste from products that are just left unsold at the market because people aren't too sure about that, and they're going to be very tentative at first until they fall in love with it. So in marketing, there is this concept of a maturity cycle, which just measures how familiar your product is to your target market. And as you move up the cycle, the product is more familiar, but that probably also means that you have more competition. So it's kind of a catch-22 here, but it's still useful to know because it helps you frame what kind of information to provide to your customers. As the product nears the peak of the market, it's starting to get tapped out, and that means demand is going to start to drop off or stabilize. So in general, the best time, and nothing is ever ideal in business startups, but in general, the very best time to get into the market is between the red line and the blue line that you see on that graph on the screen, because that means somebody's already done the really hard work of getting people to understand what the product is and how to use it, but there's still some room in the market, and it isn't completely tapped out yet. So These are some things that I find very often, especially new businesses, don't stop and think about. And I can give you a couple of concrete examples. I've been in this business for a long time, so the most recent example is we're trying to introduce goat meat into the market. And right now I would say that is still, even after several hard years of work, is still very much at the immature phase of that market. A lot of people hear goat and they turn up their nose and they start walking the other way, even though it's a very delicious product and it's very versatile and it's a great protein. People are still a little bit leery of it. Same thing when we tried to introduce goat milk into the market. It was a very hard sell. If you're of an age like I am and you grew up in a very rural state like I did, even things like the introduction of salsa and guacamole didn't come easily to people. I mean, people really had to be convinced. They can't get enough of it now, but at the beginning, you have to really sample a lot. You have to give people opportunities to try it. You have to maybe invest in some giveaways and let people have a small bit to take home. You have to spend a lot of time teaching people how to prepare it and how long does it keep and all those attributes of like what to do with it and how to really enjoy it. So again, it's not a big deal, but it is worth thinking about your product because it will impact your pricing to figure out where you fall on this product maturity curve. Okay, so, there's nothing on this graph that you probably don't already know, but I like it because it helps place your product and your target customer into context. So at the very bottom of the pyramid, you'll see eating for survival, and at the very top, you see eating for the experience. And again, for those of you that may be not producing a food product, it's still going to be very much the same. It's just that the words at the different levels of the pyramid are going to be a little bit different. You'll also notice from the arrows that as household income goes up, people are willing to buy higher on the pyramid, and also farm profit increases at almost the same rate as you move up. So you can see the staples at the very bottom. Those are basically your cereals and your grains, things that, by and large, we sell on the commodity market. One step above that, you've got your eggs and your dairy. Also vegetables, I would add, I think falls in here. The next level above where it says meat, that is true for meat. It is also true for fish and berries. People actually are willing to pay a little bit more for berries and fruits than they are for vegetables. They see them as a slightly more elegant way of dining. And then you see packaged foods, convenience foods, things that are maybe marginally processed, maybe dehydrated, maybe pre-mixed. And then you get into your luxury foods, which includes a lot of value-added product that is made on small-scale farms and small food businesses. So you may see, things like pâtés or jams or jellies or salsas or salad dressings, those kinds of things. When they're made in small batches and they're artisanal, then you begin to see them creep up there. This is also where cheeses and wines tend to live, is in that luxury part of the pyramid. Okay, so now the painful part of the presentation, and the one that I spend a fair amount of time talking to especially my farmer clients about, which is if you discover you are not making enough money and you think you're charging a fair price, or if you don't know whether the price you're charging is fair, the first thing is, don't be embarrassed. Don't try to hide it. Don't blame yourself. This is a really common problem that has a lot more to do with politics and socialization than it does with any of us. But you have to know the reality and accept the reality before you can start to take some actions. So if you are charging a fair price, or if you think you're charging a fair price and you aren't making enough money, one of the things that you can think about is increasing volume. And of course that requires that, again, that you go back and understand what's the maximum volume that you can do given the size of the property that you're operating on, the size of facilities that you have at your disposal, and the amount of labor that you can physically do and who else you have that you may be able to tap to help. So you need to know how, whether you have the desire and the ability to increase your volume. The other thing is to focus on the products that are generating the most profit. Most of us, especially those that have several different products, have some that are a lot more profitable than others, and that's why, even though it's a real pain to do it, I encourage people to run your costs on a product-by-product basis, and so know how much it costs you to, raise strawberries versus carrots versus beans versus, blackberries. Know those differences, because then you can start saying, okay, well, here's the 2 or 3 things that are really generating most of the profit, and here's the 2 or 3 things way down at the bottom that are really sinking us. And very often it's a function of labor and how labor-intensive things are. But you may need to give up those things that are down at the bottom that are dragging the business down. Another thing you can try is decreasing expenses. And particularly if you're in the early years of your business and you're still learning, chances are you're not as efficient as you're going to be. So there may be some ways that you can trim your expenses. The longer you've been in the business, the more efficient you've gotten, the harder it is to be able to decrease those expenses. So I suggest that people take a look at it, but sometimes it just isn't there to be decreased. The next thing that is there for your consideration is to really think about redefining your niche or your customer or your marketing. Maybe the markets that you're selling at aren't the right markets for you. Maybe you need to be thinking about getting your product into a place or a region of the country where there's more disposable income. So maybe you're looking at actually finding a distributor to pick up your products or to move your products. Or maybe you're looking for a way to sell in a different market. Maybe it's physically moving to a different market and trying out that. Maybe it's marketing to different customers. Maybe it's trying to find, again, to refine that target market, that target customer niche to be a little bit more higher on that pyramid that we just looked at, so that their income is up and they're looking more for luxury products than for staples. Maybe it's a matter of switching up your marketing, because as you know, the marketing materials that you have pretty much are telling a story to everybody that's looking at them. So maybe it's a matter of having somebody else look at your marketing materials and say, this is the audience that I'd like to reach. Do you think these materials are helping to get me there, or should I be looking at, upscaling my marketing materials a little bit, or maybe refreshing my logo? And then as a last resort, and as a painful resort, you have to rethink your product and your commitment to that product. If there's just no way for you to produce something that's going to be profitable for you, sometimes you just really need to cut your losses and give it up and move on to something else that is going to be a little bit more profitable and feasible for you. And I've seen both. I've seen clients that came in and were very open to doing that, and were able to turn their businesses around and actually ended up being very happy and satisfied. I've seen people who were so in love with their product that they weren't able to give it up and kept digging themselves deeper and deeper into the hole until, finances forced them to make a painful decision. So I don't want that to happen to any of you. And so, try all these other things, but know that at the end of the game, sometimes it's just a market you can't afford to play in. You're just too small, or maybe you just need more experience to get a little bit more efficient. So a few final tips. Again, I keep beating this drum, but it's so important. And I've got Steve and Madeline here with me, and I'm sure will both attest to the fact that keeping accurate records is an absolute must if you're going to be a business owner. There's really just no way around it. You've got to recalculate your costs on a regular basis. Again, prices change, and sometimes prices change dramatically and very quickly, and so don't be afraid to make mid-season decisions if that's what's called for. Barter goods and services to conserve cash, especially if you're a beginning farmer. But I have to say the IRS treats barter as a cash transaction, so keep good records about it because you're going to need to account for it. But it can free up some cash in a struggling business. Make some time for research in the same way that you're taking an hour out of your time to listen to this webinar and participate. Find time to take workshops and read and do your homework and professionally develop yourself so that you're at the top of your game, because it's a very competitive marketplace out there. And the great thing is that we're seeing new farms start up across the country, and the bad thing is that means it ramps up the competition for everybody. So you're going to have to bring your A game to make it. Know your customer profile. Almost every business owner that I start off with says, oh, I'm selling to everybody. Well, if you're selling to everybody, you're really selling to nobody, because it means your marketing materials are going to be so chaotic that they're not going to really speak to anybody. So really try to hone in on that. And again, I gave you a few little things to look out for in terms of millennials and baby boomers. Those are the big bubbles in the demographic markets right now. You've also got the Gen Xers smack dab in the middle, and they're kind of a hybrid of the two. But know who you're selling to and who's buying your product, and make that investment and speak to them. It doesn't mean that only they will come and buy your product, ironically. And then match your units to your price and your customer. And this has a little bit to do with the demographics that we talked about last month when we were together. If your customer base is baby boomers, chances are their household size is getting small. Their kids are leaving the nest. They're down to just 1 or 2 people. Maybe they don't want to buy a dozen eggs. Maybe they'd like to buy 4 eggs or 6 eggs. Maybe they don't want to buy an entire brisket. Maybe they'd like to buy just a small piece of brisket. So, rethink those units. And that can also help you. That's a good pricing strategy. If you get away from the traditional pricing units that your customers are used to seeing in the grocery stores and in the club stores like Walmart and Costco, or Sam's Club and Costco, that gives you sort of an advantage, because it puts you in a position of customers saying, oh, well, this doesn't really look like what I normally buy, and it's not priced in a way that I'm familiar. I guess I'll give it a try. So it can really work to your advantage to do that. So just a few final thoughts as I get ready to wrap up, and I'm happy to take questions. So if you've got questions, I hope you'll go ahead and type them in now. But first of all, never undercut prices to gain customers. It's not a game that you're going to be successful in as a small-scale business owner. So yes, it can create some buzz and some interest early on, but I'd rather have you give out samples than to undercut prices, because it's just not going to work for you. If there's anybody here who is maybe doing this as more of a hobby or a second business, then by all means, charge as though your livelihood depends on the results, even if it doesn't. And I say this to all of my market vendors all the time, because the person next to you may really be depending on a fair price per pound of tomatoes. So, really, really charge as though this is a profession for you, even if maybe it isn't. Be sensitive when you're asking competitors for advice. My experience is that people are overwhelmingly generous in terms of sharing with new people, but you need to really respect the fact that sometimes the strategies that people use for pricing, they just as soon not give away all the company secrets. So, do try to be respectful. That shouldn't stop you from asking, but if people are reluctant, just say thank you very much and move along. Never, ever, ever badmouth a competitor. I live in a really small state, and the chances are very good the person that you'd be talking about is related to me or is related to somebody I know, and it just doesn't reflect well on you. So just don't badmouth it. We all know that there are some people out there who sell too low and who maybe, I don't know, one of the complaints I hear from farmers market vendors all the time is so-and-so is buying product in that's not all their own product. the market will figure it out. The market will take care of them. You don't need to be the one that is going to raise the flag, because it's not going to reflect well on you. And the other thing is don't apologize for your price. Again, be ready to explain your pricing strategy, be transparent in the cost that you have, but don't apologize for your price or your product. If it's a poor product, it shouldn't be at the market. And if it's an excellent product, you shouldn't have to apologize for it. You should be proud of it, and you should be able to explain to people why this isn't your local grocery store pricing. So that's pretty much the message that I wanted to pass along to all of you. We've got a few minutes. I can take questions or comments. I see that Madeline has put up some links, I think. Let me just check. It looks like Kathy's put up some links. Cost of production study that she's inviting people to be part of, and I would encourage anybody that's willing to do that to please do so. It's so important that we be able to collect this information and share it with people, because it's really, really hard for people getting started to figure out where to pull these prices. And so we can actually take all of this and combine it so that it's not obvious where it came from, and create tools that will be helpful to the next generation of farmers and business owners. And then Madeline has put up a list of helpful apps, including some labor apps. So please go ahead and visit that link, and hopefully there will be some great apps in there. I've become a real fan of apps. And let's see, and Judith has said, yeah, that piece about not undercutting other producers is really important. And unfortunately, it does happen. And that's why I make it a part of this, because I figure no matter who I'm talking to, it's good advice. So I'm happy to take any other questions, any other comments. I will reiterate that we're recording this, and the recording will be available at our website. I will also make the slides available for you. And if you have any questions that we didn't address, or if you didn't understand something, I would encourage you to shoot me an email. I'll be happy to help you if I can. Next month, we're going to be wrapping up our 3-month marketing series with targeting your market dollars, and we'll be talking a little bit about a whole bunch of different places where you can spend money in marketing and how to make sure you're getting the best bang for your buck. And I'm going to be joined by a colleague of mine from Mississippi, who's going to be telling you a little bit about his research in Facebook ads. So that should be kind of fun and exciting. So a couple comments. Yes, can you go over what is involved in calculating break-even cost? I could, Lucy, but it's a little complicated. So I think I actually have a webinar, or maybe just a recorded PowerPoint that walks you through that. And I will go ahead and put that up on the website along with this recording, so that you can take a look at that, and then be in touch if you have any questions. It's once you figure out your costs, it's just simple formulas that you plug into. And then from Julie, can you do another webinar on handling the pricing portion in more detail? I'm always happy, yes. Anybody who requests webinars, I'm more than happy to put something together. So it sounds like getting a little bit more down into the weeds of actually figuring out these prices, and maybe that even goes to Lucy's point about calculating those break-even costs. But basically, it's going to be, the thing you want to be careful of is labor is a big part of your pricing, and people who aren't in it to make money very often are able to leave that out of it. Whereas somebody who's just starting out and struggling and has a mortgage to pay and everything is really going to be looking at creating a livelihood here. So, we'll yes, we can easily take a look at better ways to get some more information out to you, because it is a really important a really important aspect. And then Laura's got a comment here about, yes, absolutely, excellent comment, Laura. So yeah, there is a confidence in knowing that you've done your homework, knowing that the price that you're charging is based in actual fact, and this is actually what it costs. And it does give you some confidence, and it does give you some pride in what you're doing, which is very easy to communicate to your customers. And again, I mean, we live in a world where most of us are lucky enough to have some customers in our market region that are willing to pay fair prices. I know that I keep going back to eggs for some reason. It must be because it's lunchtime here for me, but eggs, the cost of eggs has been, you know, I have done things where the cost of eggs is coming out to be like $6 a dozen, and, you know, my clients are saying, oh my gosh, I could never charge that. That would be ridiculous. Well, the fact of the matter is that we have consumers who are paying $6 a dozen for eggs in our state. We have customers that are paying $5 a dozen. And we have customers that are unfortunately paying $1 or $2 a dozen. And I'm not sure that those $1 or $2 a dozen people are covering even their feed costs, let alone anything else. So it does make all the difference for you to go ahead and figure out what your costs are, because it will help you make some really good decisions. And Carrie, again, I will just say that the webinar is recorded, so you can go back and collect the part that you're missing. I did not cover specifically marketing to restaurants, but that might be another topic for another webinar and another day. So we'll certainly take that under advisement. And I do have a fact sheet that I can make available on exactly that, selling to chefs. And we've got a few more comments. Yes, exactly. So it's the attributes of the eggs. If you're going to sell it for $6 a dozen, people want to make sure that these are happy, healthy hens, and that sort of creates a mind picture that they're willing to support. And as soon as they understand, and again, it's a matter of, you know, are you certified organic or are you not? Are you certified humane or are you not? Do you have pictures of your hens at your market stand so that people see them outdoors running around in their little chicken tractors? You know, those are all really important things. So it looks like we've got some. Oh, there, hi, Londa. I'm glad to see your name. Anyway, it looks like we're wrapping up towards time here. I'm happy to keep an eye on the chat box for a few more minutes if there are questions. I thank you for the suggestions of things that we didn't cover, as well as your thanks for the things we did cover, because we're always looking for new topic ideas. And again, my email is there. If there's something specific you're looking for, by all means, let me know, and we'll get it up onto our website so that it's available for you. I wish you all luck. I know that I'm getting a little bit of spring fever, although I've got a month or two to go here before it can take off. But I hope you all have a terrific season, whatever you're producing and growing, and I hope you find exactly the right customers.